When the Biden administration froze $7 billion in Afghan central bank reserves in August 2021, it didn't stop money from moving into Afghanistan. It just handed the entire financial system to a network of brokers operating out of Dubai fish markets and Kabul money exchanges. Here is what that handover looked like on the ground. On August 15, 2021, the day Kabul fell to the Taliban, Afghanistan's formal banking system processed its last normal business day. ATMs ran dry within 72 hours. The Afghan Central Bank, Afghanistan Bank, had $9.5 billion in total reserves on paper. Roughly $7 billion of that was held in accounts at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Another $3 billion sat in accounts in Germany, Switzerland, and the United Arab Emirates. When the Taliban walked into the presidential palace, every dollar of it became politically untouchable. What was left was a country of 40 million people and import-dependent economy that ran almost entirely on US dollars. A humanitarian catastrophe already in motion, and no functioning mechanism to move money in or out of the country through any channel the international community was willing to use, except one. The Hawala network did not wait for a policy decision. It did not convene a summit. It did not require a UN Security Council resolution. It had been running continuously since the 1980s, through the Soviet invasion, through civil war, through the first Taliban regime, through 20 years of NATO occupation, and it kept running on August 16, 2021, exactly as it had on August 14. What happened next is the story of how informal finance does what formal finance cannot, and why the system that saved Afghanistan's economy is also the system that Washington has spent 2 decades trying to destroy. Afghanistan has always been a Hawala economy. That is not a poverty story. It is a geography and history story. The country has no coastline. It shares borders with Iran, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and China, none of which have ever maintained stable, interoperable financial relationships with Kabul. Formal banking. Penetration in Afghanistan was estimated at roughly 15% of the population, even at the peak of the NATO-backed republic in 2019, according to World Bank data. The other 85% of Afghans conducted their financial lives entirely through cash and Hawala, not because they were excluded from modernity, because Hawala worked and banks frequently did not. The mechanics are worth understanding precisely, because they are more sophisticated than the word informal implies. A Hawadar in Kabul receives 100,000 Afghani from a family wanting to send money to a relative in Islamabad. He calls his correspondent broker in Islamabad. That broker pays out the equivalent, in Pakistani rupees, minus a commission of roughly 1 to 2%. The Kabul Hawaladar now owes his Islamabad counterpart the equivalent of that sum. They settle the debt later, through a reverse transfer, through trade invoices, through commodity flows, or through gold. No money physically crossed the border. No bank was involved. No government recorded the transaction. The whole thing took 20 minutes. The Taliban understood this system better than any Western-backed finance ministry ever did, because the Taliban had been using it to move money for 20 years while under sanctions themselves. The UN Security Council's Taliban Sanctions Committee had been tracking Hawala-based Taliban finance since at least 2008, documenting in annual reports how the group collected taxes from opium traders, construction contractors, and border crossings and moved the proceeds through Hawaldar networks in Peshawar, Quetta, Dubai, and Karachi. When the Taliban took power in August 2021, they did not inherit a broken financial system they had to figure out. They inherited a financial system they already knew how to operate. What they did not control, and what became the critical variable in the months that followed, was the dollar supply. Afghanistan's economy runs on US dollars for large transactions and imports. The Afghani, the local currency, is used for small retail purchases, but has no international credibility. With the Afghanistan Bank frozen and international dollar transfers blocked, the question was not whether Hawala would keep money moving domestically. It was whether the network could source enough hard currency to keep the import economy from collapsing entirely. The answer came from Dubai. Khalid Rahimi has been a hawladar in Dubai's Dera district since 2009. His operation is not hidden. It is licensed by the UAE Central Bank under the country's Money Services Business Regulatory Framework, listed in a commercial directory, and operating from a shopfront between a mobile phone repair stall and a spice merchant 2 blocks from the Dubai Creek Fish Market. Khalid is a composite, constructed from documented profiles in Reuters investigative reporting, UN Sanctions Committee filings, and financial journalist accounts of the Dubai Hawala corridor that emerged after August 2021. His operation represents the median of what the UN Office on Drugs and Crime estimated in 2022 were several hundred active Afghan-linked Hawala businesses operating legally in the UAE, collectively processing an estimated $2 to $3 billion annually. Even before the Taliban takeover, after August 15, 2021, Khalid's transaction volume roughly tripled within 60 days. The reason was structural. Dubai had become the dollar clearinghouse for the Afghan economy precisely because it was the one major financial center with deep Afghan diaspora connections, a regulatory environment tolerant of Hawala operations, and no immediate political incentive to shut the corridor down. The UAE had its own reasons to maintain functional relations with whoever governed Afghanistan. It had been one of only 3 countries, alongside Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, to recognize the first Taliban government between 1996 and 2001. It was not rushing to isolate the second one, so dollars moved. Afghan businessmen with accounts in UAE banks transferred funds to Khalid's operation. Khalid's Kabul correspondents paid out in cash to importers, to families, to NGO local staff, whose international employers could no longer wire salaries directly. The commission rate rose from the standard 1 to 2% to between 3 and 5% in the first months, reflecting the increased risk and the absence of competition from formal banking. The network absorbed the premium and kept moving. By November 2021, 3 months after the freeze, the World Food Program and other UN agencies were explicitly using Hawala to pay Afghan staff and local suppliers, because it was the only mechanism that functioned. The UN had spent years publishing reports about the risks of Hawala. It was now its primary operational payment rail in one of the world's largest humanitarian crises. Fatima Ahmadi taught secondary school mathematics in Mazar-e-Sharif. She had a salary account at Azizi Bank, one of Afghanistan's largest private banks, which had suspended customer withdrawals on August 14, 2021, the day before Kabul fell, in anticipation of a bank run it could not cover. She is also a composite, drawn from documented testimony collected by Human Rights Watch, the Afghanistan Analysts Network, and UN Women Field reports between 2021 and 2023. Her situation was the median for an Afghan woman with formal employment, a bank account, and a salary that had just become inaccessible. Her school stopped paying salaries in September 2021. The Taliban's Ministry of Education, which had replaced the Republic's ministry overnight, was not processing payroll through the banking system because the banking system was not processing anything. It was, in theory, processing payments through a parallel mechanism. But in practice, teachers across the country went unpaid for between 2 and 6 months. Fatima's household survived the first 3 months on 2 things. First, her husband's brother, who worked in construction in Islamabad, began sending monthly transfers through their family's long-standing Hawaladar relationship in Mazar-e-Sharif, a broker her father-in-law had used since the 1990s. The transfers arrived in cash, in dollars, within 48 hours of the Islamabad transfer being initiated. Second, Fatima began converting those dollars immediately the same day they arrived into either gold jewelry or essential goods, because the Afghani was losing value against the dollar at roughly 30% over the course of 2021's final quarter. And holding cash in any currency felt like holding something that was actively shrinking. Her decision to convert dollars to gold immediately was not financial sophistication in the abstract sense. It was the specific, learned behavior of a family that had lived through the Mujahideen period, the first Taliban government, and 20 years of a republic that never produced a stable currency. The intergenerational knowledge of which assets hold value when governments stop functioning was more reliable than anything a Kabul bank had ever offered her. What Fatima's situation also revealed was the gender dimension of the Hawala takeover that no policy brief written in Washington captured cleanly. Under the Republic, Afghan women had been gaining access to formal bank accounts, mobile money platforms, and wage employment with salary structures that gave them independent financial identity. When the formal system collapsed, all of that vanished. The Hawala network that replaced it ran almost entirely through male brokers, male family connections, and male-controlled household financial decisions. A woman without a male family member with an active Hawala relationship had no mechanism to receive money at all. The UN estimated in early 2022 that 80% of Afghan households had experienced a complete loss of income in the preceding 6 months. The Hawala network kept money moving for those connected to it. For the roughly 20% of households, disproportionately female-headed, with no Hawala connection and no male diaspora relative, the freeze meant something closer to total financial exclusion. The dollar supply problem. By January 2022, 5 months after the freeze, the dollar supply problem had become acute. Hawala can move value across borders without physically moving currency, but it cannot conjure dollars that do not exist in the system. Afghanistan's import economy needed a continuous inflow of hard currency to pay for fuel, food, and medicine. With formal dollar transfers blocked, the physical dollar supply inside Afghanistan was draining. The Federal Reserve, in coordination with the U.S. Treasury, began shipping physical dollar cash to Afghanistan through a mechanism that was simultaneously a humanitarian gesture and a remarkable acknowledgement of how badly the freeze had miscalculated. Between November 2021 and mid-2022, the U.S. Treasury facilitated the transfer of approximately $40 million per month in physical banknotes through the Hawala system and through UN agencies, because there was no other way to get dollars into the country. The institution whose reserves had been frozen was now being kept alive with cash deliveries routed through the informal network that the freeze had empowered. The irony was not lost on the Hawala community in Dubai. Khalid's shopfront was processing U.S. government-facilitated dollar flows, alongside private remittances, UN agency payments, and NGO operational funds, all moving through a system that U.S. Treasury's own FinCEN division had spent 15 years issuing advisories, warning American financial institutions to treat with extreme caution. What most people miss about the Afghan Hawala story is what it reveals about the theory of financial sanctions itself. The Biden administration froze the Afghan central bank reserves for 2 stated reasons. First, to prevent the Taliban from accessing funds that could be used to finance terrorism or consolidate authoritarian control. Second, to preserve the assets as leverage for future negotiations about Taliban governance, women's rights, and counterterrorism commitments. 4 years later, the Taliban controls Afghanistan more completely than it did in September 2021. Its revenue base, documented by the UN Sanctions Monitoring Team in 2023, runs to approximately $5 to $2 billion annually, drawn from customs duties, mining royalties, opium taxation, and telecommunications fees, none of which require access to Afghanistan Bank's frozen reserves. The freeze did not starve the Taliban. It starved the population the Taliban governs. The $7 billion in reserves remain split between accounts frozen in the U.S. and a Swiss-administered fund called the Afghan Fund, established in September 2022 to theoretically deploy the money for humanitarian purposes without the Taliban touching it. As of 2024, the Afghan Fund had disbursed approximately $340 million, primarily to Afghanistan Bank, to support Afghani currency stability. The remaining balance sits in escrow while legal disputes, political disagreements, and competing Afghan claimant groups argue over how to release it. The Hawala network did not wait for any of this. It processed an estimated $1.8 billion in remittances into Afghanistan in 2022 alone, According to data compiled by the International Fund for Agricultural Development, that single year's remittance flow through informal channels was more than 5 times the total disbursement from the Afghan Fund across 3 years of deliberation. What the data actually shows is that the freeze did not prevent the Taliban from consolidating power. It did not create meaningful leverage for negotiations. It did not preserve the assets for the Afghan people in any operational sense. What it did do was destroy the formal financial infrastructure of the republic, permanently displace Afghan households from formal banking toward Hawala dependency, and hand the Taliban's adversaries, primarily the Hawala community in Dubai, a structural monopoly over Afghan financial flows that will persist long after any political resolution. The freeze was not a sanction against the Taliban. It was a sanction against the Afghan banking system. Those are not the same thing. And the people who designed it appear to have confused them. Afghanistan is not the edge case. It is the preview. The World Bank identified 22 countries in 2023 as either under comprehensive international sanctions or experiencing severe formal banking restrictions due to political isolation. In every one of them, the pattern documented in Afghanistan is replicating at varying speeds. Formal banking contracts. Hawala and informal value transfer expands to fill the space. Remittance flows increasingly route through Dubai, Istanbul, Nairobi, or Hong Kong, rather than through New York correspondent banks. The dollar system's reach shrinks by exactly the amount that informal systems grow. For investors and financially literate observers, the Afghan case carries a specific signal about where infrastructure capital is quietly moving. The UAE's decision to regulate rather than restrict its Hawala sector was not humanitarian instinct. It was a calculated bet that informal finance corridors are the growth layer of the next financial system. Dubai is now the clearinghouse for sanctioned economy flows from Afghanistan, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, and Syria simultaneously. That is not an accident. It is a business model. The Hawala community in Dara is not a historical curiosity. It is the operational backbone of a parallel dollar system that handles flows the formal system has decided it cannot touch. And the more aggressively Western governments use financial exclusion as a foreign policy tool, the more transactions migrate permanently into that parallel system, building its volume, its sophistication, and its independence from the institutions trying to control global finance. Khalid's shopfront in Dubai processed more Afghan economic activity in 2022 than the Afghanistan Bank did. That is the sentence that should be in every policy brief about sanctions effectiveness written in the next decade. It is not in any of them. When the formal system walks away, the informal system does not collapse alongside it. It expands. It professionalizes. It becomes, for the people depending on it, the only system that was ever actually there. Afghanistan did not lose its financial system in August 2021. It found out which financial system it had actually been running on all along.